Well, good morning. It's Barry Jones with Standards Plus History Academy. And got my red on today. Uh, our basketball team is playing in the region championship today. And of course, our school colors involve red. So everyone's wearing red. We have a pep rally and it's against the county rivals. So it's red versus blue. And our team had beaten the county rival twice during the season, close. And then that old axiom about how hard it is to beat a team three times in one season kicked in the district championship. So we lost in the district championship. Now we have a rematch in the region championship. That's like can't get away from them. So anyway. All right. So we are ready to continue. We've kind of moved through the Warren Commission and I want to transition into the second investigations. I've labeled this topic that we're currently working through the 6 investigations, and two of them are not commonly known, so that should be a little bit of new information. But this one is commonly known, and this is the second one. Obviously, the first one everybody knows, Warren Commission, and this one is the Jim Garrison investigation down in New Orleans, 67, 68, 69. And it's in the heart of it all, right? It's in New Orleans. And if you've followed my episodes, I have made the point several times that New Orleans is where this plot to kill the president was hatched and where a lot of the prep work was done. And the DA of New Orleans or Orleans Parish is going to realize that. Now, not right away, a little bit lately, but he is going to realize that. And his name is Jim Garrison. Pictured here. The guy was like 6'7". He was a huge man, very imposing figure in New Orleans in those days. I want to address a few questions. First of all, is physical evidence reliable in this case? And by this case, I mean the JFK case. You know, for years, that was the threshold. It had to be physical evidence, in my mind, to prove anything. But this case completely changed my view on that because physical evidence is so easy to mess with. You can withhold it, you can manufacture it, you can distort it, you can change it, you can forge it, you can destroy it, you can plant it. I mean, there's so many things you can do with physical evidence that later everybody says, well, there's the physical evidence. But it's like that, what I said before about garbage in, garbage out. If the physical evidence was manufactured or planted or withheld or changed or forged or whatever, it's not worth a hill of beans. And so then you have to be able to trust or rely on the government agency that's producing it or, in charge of it. And we have seen time and time again where the Dallas police manufactured or changed evidence. We've seen it with the FBI. We've seen it with the CIA, to the extent where I now question every bit of physical evidence that those agencies, those bodies produce. I just don't trust it. And so it's pushed me into the circumstantial evidence category where, you can't manufacture circumstantial evidence. Circumstantial evidence is circumstantial evidence. It is what it is. It either happened or it didn't. Uh, and so this is a discussion I had with my father. One weekend, we were taking a trip through Utah and out west. And we had a time in a car to talk. And so he asked me about this case. He'd read the Vincent Bugliosi book. And boy, he was, it's a 1,000-page book or whatever. And he was just convinced Lee Harvey Oswald did it, lone gunman, open and shut. And he started telling me about all the physical evidence. He had no idea. He had no idea. In fact, I don't think he believed me. As I start to pick away at all that physical evidence and show him that it was all distorted, and you've built your house on quicksand, on a beach and sand. It's these agencies that are producing all this evidence can't be trusted. They're the ones behind the crime. And they're the ones who, yeah, it's the same agencies that conspired to kill JFK that are the investigative agencies afterwards to pin the blame on somebody. And they are experts in their field. They know how to use evidence. They know how to manufacture. They know how to steer a case and rig it. And that's what they did. So I don't think physical evidence is reliable in this case. In fact, I think if every time physical evidence comes up, it seems like uh, years later we find out it was false, it was fake. And so I don't know what the balance should be, 50-50, 60-40, 70-30. I don't know. I guess you kind of have that, come to that conclusion on your own. But in my mind, if the FBI produces some physical evidence, or the CIA produces some physical evidence, or the Dallas police, or J. Edgar Hoover, or Alan Dulles, I don't trust. My default response now is to think, that's bogus. That's bogus. You have to convince me now. So they've destroyed their own credibility in that matter. So I do not look, a lot of people look down their nose at circumstantial evidence. I don't, not anymore. I used to, but I don't anymore. Question number 2, was there evidence of any buyer's remorse regarding the Warren report? We're going to look at that a little bit to begin today. Question 3, where does coincidence end and conspiracy begin? I heard can't remember who it was talking about this topic with respect to intelligence and how there is no such thing as coincidence in the world of intelligence. Everything is planned, everything is arranged, everything is decided in advance. And there's a lot of truth in that. You start to see all of the pieces and how they're being maneuvered and manipulated to achieve a desired result. You realize none of that was by coincidence. That was all act. That was all part of a plan. These people sit around and have these master plans, and they move people, and they move things and entities, and they cause events to happen. To the outside world, it looks like just a big coincidence. It's not a coincidence at all. And so whenever I see a witness die suspiciously, and it's always a witness who can bring harm to the cover story. If you notice, it's never a witness that buttresses the government story. Those guys live long, happy lives, but it's the ones who are threats, and they die in these strange manners. And of course, these same investigative bodies come out and say, well, she was a druggie. Well, she had a bad home life. Well, her husband and her had a fake marriage. Or, well, she was going through a divorce. Or, well, she was this. Or they were the, and it's always somebody who's a threat. And they come up with this flim flam story, and they set up the stage, they stage it. And then we're supposed to believe that these witnesses, coincidentally, right before they're about ready to bust something wide open or testify or just killed themselves, whether by accident or on purpose. No, it's not. When you start seeing the pattern over and over and over again, the old expression my mom used to tell me, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And that's how I feel with all of these happenstance occasions, these coincidental things. No, not buying it. Sorry. Last question. The government said Jim Garrison was trying to make a name for himself by bringing this sensational case. This is one of the things they're going to use against him because, again, he's a threat. So they got to ruin him. Do the origins of this case support that? We're going to look at that today, how this case came to be, and see if Jim Garrison is just this glory hound that's looking to promote himself and make a name for himself and advance along the political rungs of the ladder. And so in response to that first question, was there any buyer's remorse? Let's look at what happens. And I don't know where I'm going to put my face on this one. I guess I'm going to make it real small. There we go. In the aftermath of the event itself, we see the media rushing to judgment because that's what all the investigative bodies are telling them to do. But then when the Warren Commission is released, they double down. And there's that famous TV interview with Dan Rather, where he is telling the American people that at this time, no one else has seen the Zapruder film. And Dan Rather comes out and says, I've seen it. And in the film, now understand, this film now is owned by Time Life, which is the CIA's favorite media outlet. And it was in a safe, and it was never going to be seen by anybody. So Dan Rather can say whatever he wants. And he does. He comes out and he says, quote, the president's head went forward with considerable force. And you can see him here in this picture on the left. It appears he's leaning his head forward as he is describing this. And so, what are people to conclude? This is the day and age when you trust the newsman. And he was a news correspondent. This case, in a lot of ways, helped propel him into Walter Cronkite's chair at some point. And he's out and out lying. At no point in the Zapruder film that we eventually got to see did the president's head go forward with considerable force after being hit by the fatal shot. It went forward, his body went forward when he got hit in the back, but that was pre-fatal shot. Dan Rather was talking about the fatal shot. He said, how the bullet affect the president's head, the fatal shot. His head went forward he emphasized the word forward with considerable force. Well, by now, hopefully, anyone who is watching this has seen the Zapruder film, and his head clearly did not go forward. I don't know what Dan Rather was reporting, but again, it doesn't matter what he saw, what he interpreted. It doesn't matter. There was a cover story that had to be sold to the American people, and you can't say the head went back and to the left, which is what it did. Dan Rather knew what the cover story was, and he played the game, and his career just skyrocketed afterwards. He played the game and fooled, lied, misled, whatever word you want to use, the American people. The Warren Commission saw a version of the Zapruder film, and that later got printed in still shots in Life magazine, which reversed two of the key frames so as to the technical words, the frames were transposed, which means they were reversed to show the head going back or going forward instead of going back. And when confronted by this, J. Edgar Hoover admitted it. He's, and remember, all this evidence comes from the FBI. So you have to assume that if the FBI gave this evidence to the Warren Report or Warren Commission and had in its possession a copy of this film, that it's the one that transposed those frames. And of course, J. Edgar Hoover tried to downplay it. He says, well, they were, but it was just an innocent printing error. There was no malicious intent there. Again, I go back to what I said about coincidence and conspiracy. I don't believe there's explanations anymore. I don't believe they're, oh, shucks, it was an accident. No, this is evidence, and what happened was they were busy tinkering with all the evidence. Why would they not tinker with the Zapruder film? Why did the CIA, we told this story about, Abraham Zapruder thinking the Time Life people had come to pick up the film when it was two CIA guys who picked it up. They took it to their lab. Why would they do that? Okay. If not to run it through the cleanser or the filter first, make sure that the film agrees with the cover story. When you're shown to be messing with the evidence in so many other areas, why would anybody believe you when you say, well, it was just an error, it was just a mistake? I don't believe in that. I don't believe they made mistakes. I believe everything they did was on purpose. So anyway, just a little backstory about what the media reported in the aftermath of the event itself and the Warren Commission report. Legendary Washington Post editor, I've shown this picture before, Ben Bradley, here he is with JFK and their two wives. He's a friend of JFK, and he proved in the Watergate era capable of bringing down a presidency. Okay. His paper was one of the first news organizations to go after Nixon. Of course, Nixon was that's another story. And I promise you, we're going to get to Nixon, we're going to get to Watergate and the narrative that was sold in that whole affair. But Nixon was, in the political scheme of things, a target-rich environment. And so when he and his paper went after Nixon, there wasn't the blowback. In fact, they got awards for it, right? The Washington Post. There wasn't the blowback that there would have been if he had gone after the plot to kill JFK. So they just completely left the JFK plot alone. They didn't ask any tough questions. They didn't inquire about evidence. They didn't push on anything. They just took whatever the Warren Commission said in its report and they rubber stamped it. And later in a 2004 David Talbot interview, Bradley was asked about this. And he said, quote, "I've always wondered whether my reaction to all of that, talking about the JFK assassination, was not influenced by sort of a total distaste for the possibility that Jack had been assassinated by his own government." You know, when you're going after Nixon, you're going after a personality that wasn't very popular in the media circles of Washington. So everyone, it's politically correct to go after an individual. It'd be like going after Trump today. No one would bat an eye if the media, they do it all the time. They go after. But this was JFK, and there's a suspicion that the government was involved in this. This would bring down institutions. This would bring down much more than just a person in the form of a hated person like Richard Nixon. So they just left it alone. Ben Bradley's pretty much just admitting it. He's saying, I didn't want to find out. That I suspected that the government was behind it. I didn't want the proof. I didn't want to find out. Even Warren commissioners, and I remember now the Warren Commission was infiltrated. It was rat fucked by Alan Dulles and Gerald Ford, and all the evidence came from J. Edgar Hoover. None of these are honest brokers, but you did have some honest brokers on the Warren Commission. Senator John Sherman Cooper said later, quote, "I heard Governor Connolly testify very strongly that he was not struck by the same bullet. I could not convince myself that the same bullet struck both of them." This is regarding the single bullet theory, which is supporting the entire Warren report. You take the single bullet theory out, the Warren report falls apart. Senator Richard B. Russell said, quote, "I cannot share the finding of the committee as to the probability that President Kennedy and Governor Connolly were struck by the same bullet." And even the assistant counsel for the Warren Commission, Burt Griffin, regarding the CIA, you find out years later the CIA snookered you, that Alan Dulles snookered you, that the FBI gave you contaminated evidence, and there's going to be a sense of betrayal if you are an honest broker. You may have believed it at one point, but you don't anymore. And he says, quote, "I feel betrayed. I feel like the CIA lied to us. The CIA concealed from us the fact that they were involved in efforts to assassinate Fidel Castro, which could have been of extreme importance to us." Well, no kidding. And so here you have two of the commissioners themselves. And of course, Hale Boggs famously became a detractor of the Warren report as well. And so, here you have a schism within the Warren Commission itself between the honest brokers and the not so honest brokers. And as time goes by and new evidence comes out, they change, they morph with the times, with the evidence, and they begin to see the other side. And they begin to consider the fact that they were duped. The ones doing the duping aren't going to change their mind. Jerry Ford will maintain to the day he died that, the single bullet did. And he's the one that changed. He should know best. He's the one that changed the location of the bullet on the president's back. He gave the order, move it up, so it looks like it was shot in the back of the neck. He knows that was not a. He didn't defend the Warren Commission out of ignorance. He defended it because he was part of the apparatus that conspired to cover everything up. He had to. He's defending himself. So Yeah, we have some buyer's remorse starting to show, even in the media, which you'd figure the geniuses in today's media would, they're never going to change their mind, but some of them did. Bobby Kennedy, you know, was pretty closed-mouthed about the Warren report. Tried generally tried to keep his opinions to himself. And what we now know about Bobby Kennedy is he was preparing, if he won the presidency in '68, to reopen the case. He was just lying low. He was keeping a lot of his views to himself. But his view was the report was a poor job. That was a direct quote from Bobby Kennedy. Life magazine, November 25, 1966, uh, an edition in an article called Did Oswald Act Alone? And the article suggested that he didn't, which back then, to even suggest that he had help or a conspirator who had gotten away, that was kind of scandalous, right? You're going against what the Warren report said. New York Times, December 1966. So, the Warren report comes out in 64. Life magazine 2 years later at the end of the year. This is about 3 years after the assassination. New York Times, December 1966, announced it was forming a special task force to investigate the assassination. It's interesting what you start to see. When something is true and a report comes out and it lays it out and the people believe it, that hardens and becomes conventional wisdom, becomes an established fact. People kind of move on with their lives because even subsequent, when new evidence comes out, you can tell that the investigation was honest. They may have got some details wrong, but generally speaking, they got the main thing right. And it reinforces trust. It reinforces that belief and credibility in the report. And it makes the view harden in the general public. What you're seeing with the Warren Commission's report is as time goes on, it gets chiseled away at because all the evidence that comes out, that emerges, hurts or destroys their case. It doesn't support their case, it destroys it. It chips away at it. And so consequently, it's also chipping away at the trust. It's chipping away at that reliability factor, the credibility of the report, to the point where 3 years later, even Life magazine, which was the CIA's sort of captured media outlet, if you want to look at who owned Life magazine and the access that they were always given, New York Times, these are establishment media outlets that are 3 years after the fact saying, I don't know, can I have my doubts? The report's not holding up real well. It's not standing the test of time. The Saturday Evening Post said, quote, there's something rotten about Dallas. And it ran an excerpt from the book, Three Assassins Killed Kennedy, from a Haverford professor, Josiah Thompson. And, to run an excerpt from a book of such conspiratorial nature in such an establishment media outlet speaks volumes about the whisper campaign that's going on behind the scenes. If they'll go public with little things like this, you can imagine what people are saying behind the scenes. In the editorial in that same edition, talking about that article or that excerpt from the book, the Saturday Evening Post editorialized saying, quote, we believe the Kennedy mystery has not been solved, that the case is not closed. So, yes, as more time goes by, we have more buyer's remorse. We have more doubt, not less. We have more. And then you can't escape, you can't divorce from reality what's going on in the news. And that is in the 1968, fast forward a couple more years, we have a couple more very prominent assassinations. We have the assassination of Martin Luther King, which is blamed on another crazed lone nut, James Earl Ray. That's that famous photograph there. They're pointing in the direction of the flop house, which is, if you have seen some of my earlier episodes, I described what that was. That was a diversionary shot from the flop house. The kill shot came from, they would be pointing with their left arms in the leftward direction where the firehouse was. But everybody fell for the diversionary shot. Anyway, it's the same MO. You got the diversionary shot, you got the kill shot, and it's from distance, high-powered rifle with scope. everything's pretty much, it was a moving target, you know. MLK was walking on the balcony, and you're going to have it all set up in advance to blame a patsy. And the American people are like, I don't know about that. April 4th, 1968, we got the assassination of Martin Luther King, which is, 5 years after after Jack. And we got this another crazed lone nut assassin, no conspiracy. The King family never bought it. King family said the government did it. They maintained from day one. And then you have 2 months later, Bobby Kennedy being shot after he wins the California primary, and he's on his way to becoming our next president. He would have beaten Nixon in 68 for sure. And again, it's another crazed lone nut assassin. Sirhan walks into an ambush in the kitchen. There's Sirhan waiting for him. You never hear about the autopsy report, which said that Bobby died from a gunshot behind his right ear. He was executed by his bodyguard, Thane Eugene Caesar. But no, again, it's a crazed lone nut assassin. So, the American people aren't, some people think the American people are stupid. Well, I mean, you can push them only so far. And when things start to happen and the evidence is falling apart around the Warren report, and then you have two more prominent assassinations where if you start to just put it all in context and say, wait a second, this is the Vietnam War era. If JFK lives, we don't have a Vietnam War. I'll establish that when we get to that part of the series. If Martin Luther King was becoming more than just a civil rights leader, he was becoming a leader of the anti-war movement. He called it a poor man's war. And it wasn't just poor African-American boys that were getting drafted. It was poor whites that were getting drafted. And a lot of white people were looking around for someone to speak, give voice to what they were feeling, which is all the rich kids get to go hide out in college. All the poor kids have to go fight in this war. And so Martin Luther King was saying that. And so there was a fear amongst the higher ups in Washington, especially J. Edgar Hoover, Martin Luther King might become our first Black president. I mean, his movement has now transcended African Americans and civil rights. It's become a lot of working people. In fact, when that weekend in Memphis, he was in Memphis for the purposes of standing up and marching with the poor people in the garbage strike. And they weren't just African Americans, they were whites. He was starting to represent poor whites and becoming a voice of the people. And of course, he was a voice for peace. He said the Vietnam War was immoral and we needed to get out and stop making all the poor kids go fight this war for the rich people. So then you have Bobby. Bobby's whole campaign was anti-war. He was going to win the election in 68 with the promise of getting out of Vietnam. That was the mood of the country. The Democrats were looking for a prominent anti-war voice. Anybody not named, I forget the other guy, the guy that was I'm sorry, I can't remember his name. There was another Democrat who was anti-war who was running, but he wasn't believed to be electable. Bobby obviously was electable. And so here you have, and of course, Malcolm X is assassinated during this period as well. That's another story. But three of the loudest anti-war voices in America at this time. These are all, one of them was a president, and one of them could have been our first African-American president if he wanted to be, and the other one was on his way to becoming president. This isn't just Joe the plumber here we're talking about. These are people that have the ability or will have the ability or might have the ability to affect policy. And you're trying to, as American people, you're trying to reconcile in your mind, why is it that it's always the anti-war voices that get silenced? Why is it that the peace candidates, the people crying out for peace, are the ones who get assassinated by lone nuts? Why isn't LBJ ever, his life ever threatened, or Hubert Humphrey, or some of these pro-war guys? Why is it always the peace guys? And you start putting these puzzle pieces together, and you put it in context with some of the other things you're learning about the Warren report and some of the other stuff you're learning about your own government during this time after the church hearings, and you're starting to recognize that there is an establishment, a deep state, if you want to use that term, that wants this war and knows it has to take out the people that have the support of the people, these personalities have the support of the people who are coming out against the war. They're working at cross purposes here. They're threats. And so in their line of work, you just remove the threat. And in the 60s, that was by assassination. So in 63, you take out JFK, and all of a sudden, National Security Action Memo 263 becomes National Security Action Memo 273. Instead of pulling out of Vietnam, we have the Gulf of Tonkin. That's a complete change in policy, right? You take out Martin Luther King, and the loudest voice representing whites and blacks against the draft and against this immoral war is silenced. He goes away. You take out Bobby, and the guy who's going to pull us out of the war quick, if he wins the election in 68, is gone. And instead, you end up with Nixon, and the war goes on another 4 years. You start adding up the dollars that were spent and who is reaping the rewards from all those dollars that were spent. You start to see, well, war is a pretty profitable enterprise. These people are going to cost some folks a lot of money. And so that's what the American people are putting together. They realize these are not coincidences. These are conspiracies. And the pattern, I mean, just so blatant about it. It's always a lone nut. It's always the same MO. And the American people start to wake up to this. And one of the persons that woke up to this was Jim Garrison. And that's going to bring us to investigation number 2. And, but it's kind of interesting how that happened, because I'm going to give you a little backstory so you can see this was not a rush job by Jim Garrison to make a name for himself. April of 1962, just to give you a little back, I kind of want to bring you up to speed here. Even Kennedy knew how hateful New Orleans was to him and to his people like him. He had an upcoming trip to New Orleans planned, and Louisiana Congressman Hale Boggs, who we've mentioned before, was on one of the Warren commissioners. He told him, he says, quote, "I'm not sure about going to New Orleans. I've got reports that it's so tense down there, something could happen." You got to understand, New Orleans in this time period was full of anti-Castro Cubans. They hated Fidel Castro. And there were 2 training bases that JFK movie does a good job of setting the scene, showing where the Newman building that Guy Bannister was working out of, David Ferry and Lee Harvey Oswald in that summer of 63. They're all operating out of this Newman building, which was right in the heart of the intelligence community. CIA was located down there. Secret Service was down there. FBI was down there. Office of Naval Intelligence. They're all down there. And the Newman building was smack in the middle of it. And that's why New Orleans had become one of the epicenters of all things anti-Castro. They had 2 training bases for these Cuban brigade members, both located on Lake Pontchartrain, training these Cubans for eventual invasions of Cuba. And of course, the intelligence apparatus is all anti-Castro. The Operation Mongoose is being carried out on the streets, literally, of New Orleans, and of course down Miami as well. There's stories of David Ferry pulling up vans and trucks full of weapons and unloading them right on the street, taking them upstairs to the 3rd floor where they stored them in the Newman building, not trying to hide what he's doing. Got teams of guys that are unloading these weapons that were being these guns that were being run down to these anti-Castro Cuban refugees, these little paramilitary operations. And again, right across the street from CIA, FBI, Secret Service, they were all in on it. Okay. And then Kennedy by 62 is starting to, 61, he didn't support Bay of Pigs the way they wanted. 62, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they said they chickened out there. Instead of ordering an invasion or bombing the missile sites, he just put in that blockade and peacefully settled the Cuban Missile Crisis. These people didn't want the Cuban Missile Crisis peacefully settled. They wanted a war. And so Kennedy's becoming a problem for them. And of course, by 63, he starts negotiating with Castro. And after 62, a lot of people realize he's made a promise to Khrushchev never to invade Cuba again. He's going to have to shut down all of Operation Mongoose. He's going to have to shut down, take all their weapons. He's going to have to arrest guys like Frank Sturgis and E. Howard Hunt because they want to keep the war going. And so he's right. He understands correctly that New Orleans is probably not a place I need to be because we're on different sides of this. I'm trying to keep the peace, and I've made promises to Khrushchev, and I can't have this private war going on against Cuba, bringing us to the brink of nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis really changed JFK and Khrushchev, and they realized, we have a lot more at stake here than these trifling figures do. They want a war in Cuba. They don't consider the consequences of what that war could cause, a nuclear war between two superpowers. I got to think about the bigger picture here. And so, he was right. New Orleans was the heart of the Confederacy, right smack downtown, right smack dab in the middle of their downtown. They have a big monument to Robert E. Lee. Lee Harvey Oswald, born in New Orleans, was named Lee after Robert E. Lee. This was a Confederate town. Okay, it was a Confederate town. That's why Lee Harvey Oswald did not like pennies, because it had Abraham Lincoln's picture on it. He didn't like bills that had Abraham Lincoln's image on it. We talked the other day about his alibi and how even the Geraldine Reed, who held onto the cash box at the Texas School Book Depository, she'd only known him a month and a half, right? He'd only been working there a month and a half, and she already knew he didn't like pennies. So this was sort of drilled into everybody who was born and raised down in New Orleans, and this is a Confederate town. It was also a mafia town. You see the picture there in the middle, Carlos Marcello. He pretty much ran New Orleans, and anything that was going on had his blessing, his support. If it didn't last very long. When you talk about Guy Bannister and what was going on in the Newman building, the mafia was fully involved in that as well. You remember, we'll make the point later, but the mafia and CIA were in bed together trying to get rid of Castro. So this is one city where the intelligence community having such a big presence, and the mafia having such a big presence, was kind of convenient because they're both going to war right now against Cuba, against what they called the Beard, Fidel Castro. And so New Orleans in 62, 63 was a hotbed of anti-Castro activity, of organized crime activity, of intelligence operations. And of course, it was a Confederate town. And so when Kennedy made that comment to Hale Boggs, it was based in reality. Kennedy was not a fearful man. That's why he went to Dallas. Dallas was a hostile place, but he was realistic, and he certainly understood what the temperature was in New Orleans, at least for people like him. Here you see in the picture on the right, I mentioned that Jim Garrison was tall. You see him towering over everybody, and these people are standing on steps. He's standing on the sidewalk, and these people, some of them are standing on steps, and he still towers over everybody. March 1st, 1967, through March 1st, 1969, literally a 2-year span there, the whole country was paying attention to what was going on in New Orleans because there was a trial down there. And if you've seen the JFK movie, kind of a snapshot view of what was going on. It was a trial of a prominent New Orleans businessman named Clay Shaw. You see the bottom picture there. He's the guy in the white hair. He's played in the movie by Tommy Lee Jones. He does a good job. This guy owned the Trade Mart, and the Trade Mart was one of the most important economic, I don't know what word I should use. It was parts of the New Orleans economy, but not just New Orleans, all the way up the Mississippi River. Any trade that was happening between the United States and Latin America or South America, the input-output area was New Orleans. That's where the Mississippi River feeds into the Gulf of Mexico, which feeds into the Caribbean, the Atlantic. All that trade comes in. That's the point of entry. And of course, the Trade Mart sat right there, square in that port of entry. And so we're doing a lot of trade with Latin America, and they with us. And so Clay Shaw was a very prominent individual in New Orleans and elsewhere because of his control or his involvement in trade that was coming through his trademark. Well, anyway, he gets indicted by a grand jury for his alleged role in the assassination conspiracy involving himself, Dave Ferry, Guy Bannister, Oswald, and the CIA. Now, Jim Garrison, before he brought this case, realizing what he's going to be going up against, wants to make sure that he's not just on some jihad by himself going after Clay Shaw and in an unwinnable trial, going to drag a lot of people through the mud unnecessarily. So he turns over his evidence to a 3-judge panel in Orleans Parish. He says, I want you to look at my evidence. And I've indicted Clay Shaw. I want you to look at my evidence and tell me what you think. Is this a reasonable case? Is this justifiable? And the 3-judge panel ruled unanimously that it was. They said, quote, there's probable cause to believe that Clay Shaw had participated in a criminal conspiracy to assassinate JFK. Now, Jim Garrison's modus operandi here is not to go after just Clay Shaw. Right? That's the first bite in the apple. And what he wants to do is get a conviction of Clay Shaw and get people talking. If he can get a conviction and get Clay Shaw to speak, then at some point, he'll lead them to the next guy in the conspiracy, who will lead them to the next guy. It's called what he called peeling the onion. So Clay Shaw is not the ultimate target here, but you got to start somewhere. And so that is what we're going to be talking about in this second investigation. But it didn't happen, 67, that's 4 years after the assassination. It didn't happen in the immediate aftermath. So what's the backstory here? Because the question is, was he a glory hound? If he's a glory hound, as soon as he learns what we're fixing to learn, he would have brought the case. That's when everyone's attention is focused on this. 4 years later, people have kind of gone on with their lives. So what happened? Well, the origins of the case are rooted in something that happened to Jack Martin. Jack Martin is pictured at the top right, and he worked in Guy Bannister's office. But Bannister was his boss. That summer of 63, Jack Martin kind of did some private investigative work for Guy Bannister, and he said later there wasn't a lot of private investigating to do. So he said most of the time I was just sitting around the office waiting for work, but he was there. And the night of the assassination, they were at a bar, they were drinking together and coming back to the office, and he made a couple comments that got his boss, Guy Bannister, all fired up at him. And Bannister ends up taking out his weapon, unholstered his weapon, and beat Jack Martin with it. You said, what did he say? Well, they had, they were both kind of tipsy from drinking, and he'd made some comments about the comings and goings of all these people. Of course, the news has already come out. This is the night of the assassination. The news has already come out that Lee Harvey Oswald has been arrested for the crime. And, Jack Martin is processing all this, and he's just kind of remarking to Guy Bannister, wow, that guy was in our office all summer long, and boy, it really starts to, you can see him, he's kind of just thinking out loud. He's like, we had a lot of strange people in our office all summer long. And Guy Bannister didn't like that. And he mentioned something about writing a book about it. And Guy Bannister got really upset at that. And then he starts accusing, Jack Martin of rifling through his files. Guy Bannister was like J. Edgar Hoover in the sense that he had this very large, these very large filing cabinets full of all kinds of incriminating information, stuff he'd stored up for years as former. He used to work in the FBI, and that was his prized possession in that Newman building was those files. And several times he found the files, the drawers open, and somebody had been in them, and he was very suspicious. And of course, now you add alcohol to it, and now you add Jack Martin talking about all these interesting people and Lee Harvey Oswald, and kind of openly processing what they're learning about Oswald and wondering if there's a connection back to the Newman building, back to Bannister, back to what they were doing there in New Orleans. And Guy Bannister just loses. They get back to the office and the files are open. And he accuses, he's, oh, you're going to write a book about what you've seen, huh? And you're going to use information you get from my files. So he starts putting pieces together. Next thing you know, pulls out his pistol and just starts beating Jack Martin with it. And these guys were friends, supposedly. And so Martin ends up in the hospital. He almost died. And he ends up in the hospital as a result of an assault and battery. So when he wakes up, there's police officers there from New Orleans wanting to take a statement. What happened to you? And so Martin, who's furious, what happened to him, starts talking. And he tells, they said, well, what caused all this? And he tells them the story I just told you. Well, I brought up Lee Harvey Oswald and how he worked for us all summer, and he just lost it. Brought up all these other people that were in our office working, and he just lost it. He accused me of going through his files. And of course, the New Orleans police uh, are interested in this. They're like, what? Lee Harvey Oswald worked here. What are you talking about? And everyone in the world is hearing the news that Lee Harvey Oswald just assassinated the president, killed a cop. And now they're finding out that he was right under their noses all summer working in New Orleans for Guy Bannister. And it wasn't just Guy Bannister. He talks about David Ferrie. He talks about the Cubans. And he tells them the story about how what he knew about David Ferrie was he was a pilot. He had heard that he was going to be a getaway pilot for somebody who was posing as Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas. We've talked about the doppelgangers, and that he had traveled to Dallas, Texas the night before the assassination. And here, Jack Martin's just dropping all this knowledge on the New Orleans police, which of course is going to end up in the DA's office. And Jim Garrison's going to have to decide what to do with this information. The picture at the top right is Jack Martin, and the picture bottom right is his friend Guy Bannister. So all this information comes about as a result of an assault. Guy Bannister assaults Frank Martin, and Frank Martin wakes up and tells the cops what he knew. And, he's mad. He's got an axe to grind against his boss. And so he's telling a story. He tells the story of Jimmy Johnson, who is the airplane mechanic for Ferrie. And he says, if you want to verify that Ferrie is a pilot, everybody kind of knew he was a pilot, but if you want to verify that he was supposed to go to Dallas, or he did go to Dallas the night before, talk to Jimmy Johnson. He's the guy who gets the plane ready. So they did. They went and talked to Jimmy Johnson. And Jimmy Johnson was, well, kind of interesting. He says, a couple weeks ago, Ferrie told me to go to the airport and retrieve a package in a car that was just parked there, just sitting there under the front seat. And so he said, I went, I found the car, and I opened the door, I got under the seat, there's a package there, I retrieved it, I brought it back to David Ferrie. He said, Ferrie opened it up, it was full of cash. And he said, Ferrie told me he's going to take $7,000 and he's going to take this money and go buy himself a new car. And then he took the rest of it and he put it in the bank. So they subpoenaed Ferrie's bank records, and they find out that right before the assassination, in the weeks leading up to it, he deposited $7,000 in cash into his account. So that's what's happening in the background. Jim Garrison's really not even involved in this yet. This is just the police investigators kind of following one lead after another. The first lead came about as a result of Frank Martin, and he gave him a name, Jimmy Johnson. They go talk to Jimmy Johnson. He gives them a lead. So they get the subpoena. They look at the bank records and they corroborate basically what Jimmy Johnson told them. So now they know Jimmy Johnson's telling them the truth. So they start putting this together. And of course, this is when Jim Garrison gets involved. And they start trying to pull together the players. And obviously one of the players in this is Guy Bannister. That's his building there. And what Jim Garrison learns is that this building was simultaneously serving two purposes, that the back entrance was the anti-Cuban Operation Mongoose that Guy Bannister was running, and the front entrance was where Lee Harvey Oswald ran his Fair Play for Cuba committee out of. And they found posters. You can see the stamp there with the address that goes right to that door in the front with the red arrow and Oswald's name. Jim Garrison finds an arrest report from when Lee Harvey Oswald got arrested with this after that altercation with Carlos Bringuier in the late summer of '63, and then of course he discovers that David Ferrie has been working at this building, and he's been running guns, and he's been involved in these training sites in Lake Pontchartrain, the North Base in particular. And obviously, Jim Garrison is a little bit curious about this Newman building, everything that seemingly is coming out of this Newman building, because it seemingly is doing two things at the same time. It's working against Castro in Cuba. It's also working for Castro, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And so he knows he's got three players, Guy Bannister, David Ferrie, and Lee Harvey Oswald. And so he can't do anything about Oswald. Oswald is in custody in Dallas at that time. Well, this is days later now, and Oswald's dead by this point. So he's wanting to talk to David Ferrie, and especially wants to know about this trip that David Ferrie allegedly made to Dallas. Is this part of the assassination conspiracy? Is this just an innocent, what is this? He really wants to corroborate Jack Martin's claims. And so far, everything Jack Martin has told him has turned out to be true. So this is just another fact-finding mission to find out if Jack Martin is legitimate. So he pulls in, and remember in the JFK movie, he does it on, I think it was Easter Sunday. He pulls in David Ferrie, and well, maybe that was Clay Shaw on Easter Sunday. I don't remember. Anyway, he pulls in David Ferrie, and they make some small chit chat about being pilots. Jim Garrison had been a pilot in the military as well. And so he says, "Where were you, Mr. Ferrie, on November 21st, 1963? And so the story goes that Jim Garrison knew where he was. He independently corroborated the story that David Ferrie had gone to Texas. What he wanted to hear from Ferrie was why. And Ferrie made up some story about goose hunting or going ice skating, and it wasn't believable. It was in the middle of a terrible storm, and Garrison didn't find Ferrie's alibis or his story to be believable. And so he's suspicious. He thinks Ferrie is hiding from him the real purpose, the real nature of that trip. And of course, Garrison knows what Martin has told him. He's not accused Ferrie of it. He didn't bring it up, but he knows that Martin has said Ferrie went there to be a getaway pilot for one of Oswald's doppelgangers. And Ferrie's making up stories about goose hunting and ice skating, and they didn't even have guns, and so he didn't believe it. So he turns him over to the FBI. Now, Jim Garrison has no reason to believe the FBI is corrupted. He has no reason to believe the FBI is complicit in any of this. He's a former FBI guy himself. He's an agency guy. He believes in the FBI. So he's doing what he's supposed to. He turns him over to the FBI because, as we know, by this point, the case has gone federal. And the FBI is in charge of all the evidence. It's doing all the investigating. And it's going to be turning all the evidence over to the Warren Commission. And so Garrison does not try to, grab the glory for himself and go off and Lone Ranger it. He turns Ferrie over to the FBI saying, "I'm not sure I believe his story. You might want to check into this guy." And the next day, the FBI releases Ferrie with a public apology, puts the blame on the reason he was even called in for questioning or held overnight was because of Garrison in the New Orleans DA office. It wasn't the FBI wasn't the FBI's doing. And Garrison's like, "Well, I'm just doing what we always do in these cases." And he feels kind of like, backed over by a bus a little bit. And so at this point, Garrison drops the investigation. He says, "Well, if the FBI is satisfied with David Ferrie's alibi, far be it from me to question the FBI." And he drops the investigation. So the story just goes away. And that would have been the end of it, right? Jack Martin's story to the police, which gets corroborated through Jimmy Johnson and some of the other things that they find out about the Newman building, Guy Bannister, and so all that stuff just goes away. The suspicion about David Ferry and it just goes away. That's why we don't end up having an investigation or a trial until 67, because in 63 and 64, when this case was hot, Jim Garrison started doing the legwork, laying the groundwork for a potential investigation, for a potential trial. But he was cut off at the knees by the FBI. And the FBI, once they said, hey, Ferry's not involved, well, there goes one of his star witnesses. So there ain't any point pursuing this. So Jim Garrison didn't pursue it. He let it go at that point. I think that shows, going back to my question when we started today, when Garrison eventually does bring this case, the government is going to make a big deal about how he's trying to raise his profile. He's wanting to run for governor of the state, or he's a glory hound, and they paint him that way. No, that's as far from the truth as you can get. This is typical operating procedure, right? Standard operating procedure that the government does to somebody who becomes a threat to their cover story or a threat to them in any way, shape, form. They destroy them. And we've already learned in some cases, they kill you. That's how they got rid of JFK, MLK, and RFK. And they had patsies that they'd set up to take the fall. In Jim Garrison's case, they're going to try and destroy his reputation. That's just as effective. If you can destroy the person who is the biggest believer in conspiracy at this point, if you can discredit that, you discredit the whole movement. You discredit anybody who believes it was a conspiracy. If you just kill him, now the conspiracy theory grows. But if you can discredit him and call him a conspiracy theorist, which, by the way, that term came from the CIA. They instructed their Operation Mockingbird media to use that term to describe anybody who disagreed with the Warren Report. So that's you use disinformation, misinformation. You use a discrediting process to undercut anybody who would seek to investigate this crime and come at it from the point of view that they think it was a conspiracy. You see it in effect today with our political candidates. Who do they go after? What means do they use? How do they try to destroy that person? And who do they leave alone? I used to marvel at the Watergate narrative. And the old narrative was that Nixon was paranoid about the 72 election. I was just thinking, why? He won 49 states. He was never in jeopardy of losing to George McGovern. And then you find out he wasn't really paranoid about George McGovern. He was paranoid about Ed Muskie. He was paranoid about Tom Eagleton. And the conventional wisdom was that Ed Muskie self-destructed and had to drop out of the race, and that Tom Eagleton self-destructed and had to drop out of the race. And then you find out about the plumbers and the dirty tricks, and you realize, no, they didn't self-destruct. They were destructed, and they were forced to drop out of the race because Nixon didn't want to run against them. They were stronger candidates. He wanted to run against McGovern, and that's who he got. So you left him alone and beat him like a drum in the fall. So that's how intelligence works. The threats have to get neutralized, and so they come out with stories, and they come out with defaming. They defame you. They invent evidence. They manufacture evidence. They use all the same methods, and so they're always. I get a kick out of this as well. One of the arguments for not releasing the rest of the JFK documents is it would reveal methods and sources. It's always methods and sources. Yeah, the methods and sources that were used to set up Oswald to be the patsy and to turn everybody's attention or divert everybody's attention away from the real conspirators. Those methods and sources need to be protected because they still use them. They still use the same methods and sources. So anyway, don't want to get too far off track here, but answering my questions that we started with today, I think the first question was, and it was, is physical evidence the be all end all? And I think we've seen it's not. Okay. It's not, because it's too easily corrupted. And then there was another question about, well, I need to, if you don't mind, if you'll indulge me just a second, I want to go back to that slide. I always forget my questions when I have multiples. So it's why I usually try to keep it to one. But anyway, the first question we answered. The second question was there evidence of any buyer's remorse regarding the Warren report? And I think we showed even within the media, there became some buyer's remorse, but especially within the Warren commissioner, some of the Warren commissioners themselves. Third question, where does coincidence end and conspiracy begin? I don't believe when it comes to these intelligence agencies that are involved in all this, there is such a thing as coincidence. No, it's all conspiracy. They don't allow for coincidences. They plot every move in advance. And we find out about it after the fact. And that's why we think it's coincidence. There is no such thing as a coincidence with the CIA or the FBI. And then lastly, the government said Jim Garrison was trying to make a name for himself by bringing this sensational case. Do the origins of this case support that? It's clearly not. He dropped the case. Okay. He did his duty. He was duly elected to pursue crimes and look into and see if there was enough evidence to support a case. When the FBI said Ferry was free and clear, he dropped the case. In 67, when he did eventually bring the case, he didn't go Lone Ranger it again. Even then, he submitted his evidence to a 3-judge panel. Says, you determine if there's enough evidence here to proceed. And they came back with a unanimous verdict. Yes, go ahead. Probable cause here that Clay Shaw participated in a conspiracy. So at no point did Jim Garrison Lone Ranger this. He wasn't seeking glory. And it certainly is not what's going to happen to him. He's bringing on himself hellfire and damnation. It's going to pretty near ruin his life just trying to get to the truth of this matter. So I look at Jim Garrison as a hero. I view him as one of the heroes in this case. He's the first and to this day the only law enforcement officer, court officer to bring a case in the JFK matter, a criminal case. So I think what happens to Jim Garrison becomes a cautionary tale to all future DAs who might be interested in bringing a case. They see what happened to Jim Garrison. They say, I ain't touching that with a 10-foot pole. But Jim Garrison did. And that's why he's a hero in my book. Okay. That's today's episode. I think that's episode 45. We'll continue on with the Clay Shaw trial. Obviously, it's going to happen. So him dropping the case is not the end of the story. So we'll get into that tomorrow. If you like my content, feel free to check out my website, sphistory.com or barryljones.com. I teach homeschool kids. I teach regular high school, and then on the side, I also teach homeschool kids any of the high school histories they may need. I also provide content if they'd rather just do it themselves. So that's on sphistory.com. Feel free to subscribe to this channel. It's free. Check out the other videos, the other episodes that precede this one. And I've got them numbered so you can kind of follow in chronological order the same time, the chronological timeline that we're following, that I've been following all along. Hit the notification bell, hit the thumbs up. And until next time, I hope everybody has a great day. Thank you.